or buenas tardes. I am Maria, and I came here for the very first time almost 500 years ago.
Looking good.
Gracias. It's Fountain of Youth. However, I think it's beginning to wear off. It doesn't seem to be as effective as it used to be.
Well, you're looking good for 200 years old.
Almost 500. You see, 1528. I came with the Pompeia de Narvaez expedition to establish a city in a place called La Florida, in a place on the Bay of Espiritu Santos. Espiritu Santos you know today as Tampa Bay. However, it was a long and arduous journey. I grew up in Spain, in a little town called Cuellar, in the center of Spain. It was a beautiful place, and as a little girl, I would play around in the vineyards with my friends. And we would play tag and all the hide and seek and all the things that children play. The vineyards were part of the great estate of the Duke of Albuquerque. We would play around the castle. Sometimes we would go into the castle and play there. I would get so tired by the end of the day that I would practically fall down. And after dinner, my papa would put me on his lap and call me his little princess. Well, it wasn't long before I grew Papa's lap. I became a young lady, and I was betrothed to a neighbor's son, Juan Velasquez, a young man who had potential. But of course, he was the sixth son of a sixth son, so he was not to inherit a lot. And the first thing that he did after we were married, a couple of years later, you see, before you got married, he would have to provide me with a dowry. He would have to provide me with all kinds of things that I would need to set up a household. And so off he went to fight in the wars of King Charles V. He fought all over Christendom. And one day he came home and we were married. He was down at the tavern telling war stories with his friends, they were bragging about what great conquistadors they were. When he came home, and he told me, Maria, pack your things. We are going on a great adventure. I have signed us up to go to the New Spain. We are going to build a city there. Well, I was not really very excited about this prospect. I had heard what happened to these ships that went to the New Spain, even as far away from Sevilla as I lived. I had heard about the ones that were swallowed up by the great storms. I heard about the ones that were swallowed up by the sea monsters. I heard that there were many people who never returned. And so I was very, very afraid. But what could I do? I was married. I would have to follow my husband if he said I had to go. And so I packed my things, what few little things that I could get, into a basket to take with me. Where, of course, I took with me my spice box, because a spice box was one of the most important things you had in your kitchen in order to provide your food. Just in case they had some of the wonderful sheep in this new world, I took along my spindle, for that is one thing that we women knew how to do in Spain, was to spin. And we'd walk down the street spinning and tossing our spindle in the air and making all kinds of wonderful wool and fibers from that merino sheep that we were so proud of in our country. Why, people all over Christendom wanted our wool. Another important thing that I would need to take with me was a knife in order to eat meat, if we had any. A spoon and a bowl would also be a part of my kit. These are my shoes. And when a lady such as myself went out for a walk, we never walked through the muck and the mud in our beautiful leather shoes. We put on our overshoes. We call them chopins. And the chopins are very light, very much like, they're like overshoes, but they keep your feet and your skirts way up off the ground. And of course, ones that are this high, I would have to have someone accompany me. I would have to have a servant or a slave walk with me in order to keep me from falling over, but they weren't that bad. You could wear them. I'm going to pass them around. Would you like to see how heavy they are? I'll pass one on this side and one on this side.
Thank you.
Enough trouble walking on flat heels.
Another thing is important, even though it's a warm day today at sea, and we're going to be at sea during the winter, it would be cold. So I also pack these, and a pair of gloves. So off we go. We travel down the old Roman world through road through Extremadura. At night, we would camp along the side of the road, and I could hear the wolves howling in the mountains below. It was the springtime, and it was beautiful there. We would see the cork trees getting new leaves, the trees that they took the bark off for the corks for our wine and our olive jars. I also would smell the fields of lavender. They were just so pungent at that time of year. And I gathered some and put them in my pomander so that when I got to the areas where there was a lot of interesting things in the streets, I could go like this and smell the lavender. Let me see. I'll get that one off today. I got it on good. We were famous for our fields of lavender, too. But I was never so surprised as when I arrived in Sevilla, the place where they offload all the ships coming from the New World. There was mountains and mountains of gold piled up along the river, being taken to the, and that was only taken to the king, and that was only the king's share. It was amazing. Why, they tell me that in the New Spain, the streets are paved with gold, and we are going to build a city there. While in Sevilla, I went to see a soothsayer. It's something only a wise woman would do, going on such an adventure. The woman of her nachos read my cards, and she said, "Maria, I see danger in your future." I didn't need a soothsayer to tell me that. She said, "You must build a city where you land, or all will be doomed." Well, that didn't make me feel any more encouraged. So we got on a barge and floated down the river to Sanlúcar de Barrameda. At Sanlúcar, there is a little church, a little chapel. It's called the Chapel of O. And I went in there and prayed for the journey, a safe journey ahead. But when I left, I asked someone, "Why do they call this the Chapel of O?" And they said, "Oh, it is named for our Holy Mother." That didn't make any sense to me, but why O? And they said, well, when the archangel came down and told the Blessed Mother Mary that she would be pregnant with child, she said, oh. Well, we all piled on to the ship eventually. Ark. We piled onto the ship, and we had to actually get on some barges to go out to the ship because there's a great bar there, sandbar in the middle of the bay, and you could see Pamphia de Narvaez ships out beyond that. And so we went over that bar and onto the ships. There were 5 of them in all. There were 600 of us, and these ships weren't much bigger than this room. Can you imagine all the number of people? There were about 125 people on each ship. I did not wear my farthingale when I climbed up overboard. I didn't think that would be an easy thing to do. Neither did I wear my chopins. I tried to be as comfortable as possible in these crowded quarters because you had no place to stay. This was no cruise ship. This was a working ship, a small working ship. Down below in the hold is where they kept the horses. You didn't want to go down there. They put storage things down there. We stayed on the deck. And we had to build, or bribe the carpenter to build us a little shelter to get us out of the stormy weather. Excuse me. Anyway, we put out to sea. We went to the Canary Islands. So everybody on board was seasick the first 2 weeks at sea. Can you imagine? Those brave conquistadors, they were all hanging onto their bellies and leaning over the ship. Thank you very much. But off we go. We arrive in the Canary Islands and take on some water and firewood for the rest of the journey. What a journey it was. We were out to sea for 6 weeks. It was horrific. Every day we ate beans for lunch and dinner. Every day we ate beans cooked in pork fat. And towards the end of the journey, that pork fat was getting a bit old, a bit rancid. We arrive eventually in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, in Santo Domingo. And there we leave the ship for the first time in weeks. It was, my goodness, I could barely stand up. I still had not got used to the land, and I was very woozy at first. And there were several men who left the expedition right then and there. 125 of them left because they were promised riches and gold right there. But did my one? Oh no. We were going on to the Bay of Espiritu Santos because we had heard that the streets were paved with gold there. We left Santo Domingo to go to Santiago de Cuba to get more horses, for most of the horses had died coming over on the ship. We did occasionally have a nice meal of horse meat when we weren't having beans. There was not much to do on these ships either. You could read if you had a book. You could read. You could maybe play cards. And of course the sailors played cards like you wouldn't believe. And there were sometimes fights that broke out between them. In fact, they tried to take the cards away from the sailors. when you got on the ship, and the conquistadors, when you got on a ship, they took your cards away. Let me see these are the cards. They would take the cards away, and then the sergeant of arms would sell them a new deck of cards. That was to be sure. Well, you see, it was illegal to bring cards onto the ship, but it wasn't illegal to play cards on the ship. So that made sure that the cards were not marked. They got a new deck of cards. And it helped, in some cases, to prevent some of those fights. Want to look at my cards? Here you go. So, we arrived in Santo Domingo. They found out, to Cuba. They found out that there were no horses there, but there was another place, a little further away, where there were horses. And so the governor, Pamphilio de Narvaez, sent Cabeza de Vaca, the treasurer of the ship, and the king's man, to go to this place to get some more horses. And while he was there, a great storm blew up. A storm that was so violent, with winds so strong, that the men had to hang on to each other, 9, 10 at a time, to keep from being blown away. The buildings were blown away, and the ship was dashed upon the rocks, and they were not able to find or identify the men that had remained behind. This was, as the native people there called it, the season of El Hurricane. We begged the governor, please, please, do not put out to sea again during this season. And so we stayed the winter in a little town of Zuega on the south coast of Cuba. In the spring, we left again. In the meantime, Pamphilio de Narvaez had found Diego Murillo, to be the navigator, the pilot of the ship. He said he had been to Tampa Bay of Espiritu Santos, many, many times before, picking up slaves and such. And so he knew his way here. And so we set out to sea. And the first thing this great pilot did was get us stuck on the sands of Canero. We rested there with our ships buried in the sandbar for 2 weeks, not knowing whether we were going to live or die, when another storm came and raised the water up and raised the ships out of that sandbar, and off we went again. We were sailing around the southern coast of Cuba, heading towards Habana, when we were blowing across the straits. We were going to Habana because Pamphilio de Narvaez wanted to see his wife. She had been the governor there while he was off to get this expedition together. He left her in charge, which was the custom of the time. You left your wife in charge of your estates. That was a very old custom in Spain, going back to the original Reconquista, when they were taking Spain away from the Moors. And so women were left in charge of the estates, and women had property rights. Well, he never did get to see his beloved, Maria de Valenzuela. We were pushed up along the coast of La Florida, and we arrived at the mouth of the Bay of Espiritu Santos on April 15th, 1527. There at the mouth of the bay, we were getting low on food and supplies. We traded with the savages there, the Indios. We gave them some trinkets, and they gave us venison and fish. And then the following morning, we sailed into the bay. But it turned out we were not in the great bay of Espiritu Santos. Diego Murillo had done it again. It seems that he had taken his measurements of where he was from inside the bay and took us into Boca Ciega Bay rather than into the Bay of Espiritu Santos. However, we landed, we put people ashore, and we found that there were absolutely no one in this village. They had all fled the night before. Oh, they had heard of the likes of Diego Murillo before, and they were not going to be captured as slaves. We looked around, and there was nothing to be had there. I can assure you, there were not streets paved with gold. There was a building that could hold over 300 people, and there were thatched roofs, shacks, much like what our farmers live in back in Spain, but no streets of gold, no riches, no pearls, nothing, except someone found a little gold bell wrapped up in a fishnet, but nothing else. The governor called the men together and said, I'm going to send Cabeza de Vaca and some of you, the soldiers, inland to see if they could find the Bay of Espiritu Santos. And they did, and they returned in a few days and said that they had found it. And they had taken some slaves, some Indians they came upon, and who eventually would lead them up to the head of the bay. In the meantime, myself and the other 9 women that were on this expedition were put back on the ships, and we would never see our husbands again. We stood there as we watched them march off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. I discovered years later from the account that Cabeza de Vaca had written that my husband Juan was one of the first to die during this expedition. He was very anxious to cross a river in flood in the spring. It was what we know as today the Withlacoochee River. And he pushed his steed onward, and he, in full armor, was swept away, never to be seen again. But I do understand that the rest of the conquistadors had another good meal of horse meat that night. Poor Juan, he's probably down there at the bottom of the river still today. This expedition changed America, changed the America of the native people who lived here forever. These expeditions brought with them diseases and violence, and it brought with them a whole new way of dealing with people. They did not, the native people were not able to sustain this, and it was a different world that came here. The people who lived here were a woman, Cacica. We know, we've named this one Antonia, Cacica Antonia. A few years later, when Pedro Menendez visits the Gulf Coast, he meets this woman. This woman is the leader of the women in the Calusa people to the south. She is an extraordinary person. Of course, the Spanish don't understand that she is a leader. They believe that she is Carlos, the man they call the chief. They believe that she is his wife at first. That's not what she was. She was a leader in her own right. When Menendez meets with them, she's sitting on a dais beside Carlos. Carlos has 500 women behind him. She has 500 women behind her in a building that could hold over 2,000 people. What an extraordinary thing that must have been. As Menendez proceeds up towards this building, he passes groups of women holding their totems, their masks, and they're singing. They're singing probably the story of their clans. it was an interesting, fascinating time, and we know so little about those people that they met here. We know that Pamphile de Narvaez ran into a wonderful pair of women. Not that he appreciated it. A woman named Neily helped save one of his young men from the wrath of her father because, well, Narvaez had wanted gold so badly, he tried to torture the Indians to get to where the gold was, to tell them where the gold was. And of course, we know there's no gold here. But one thing that he did was that he sicked his war dogs on Herahigua's mother, the honored man of the Tocobaga. He also cut off Herahigua's nose. And so when Juan Ortiz is captured by the native people, and that's a whole story in itself, naturally, Herahigua is not real pleased to have a Spaniard in his midst, especially when he caught his reflection in a pool of water, which would only remind him again. But Eulalie and her mother took pity on this young man because he was only about 16 years old and helped him to escape. And he was sent to a neighboring tribe. And it was probably her fiance or her betrothed that he went to stay with, and that ended that whole relationship. But we only get little tiny tidbits about who these people were and what extraordinary people they were. Now, I've told you a little bit about one woman, but there were plenty of women coming over here right from the beginning. There were plenty of Spanish women coming into Hispaniola, Haiti today, where Columbus established his foothold in the Americas. You have to have women, right? How do you build a city without women? I can assure you, men have learned that over the years. They need us. We have to civilize them. Otherwise, they'd just be running around looking for gold, fishing, killing each other, but not settling down and actually building a city. You know. What was that? Not taking showers. Oh, yeah, that was awful. I can imagine when the Indians first saw, because Indians were very, very clean people. I can imagine when they first saw these people getting off the ship. You know, there's one story where Columbus says, "Oh, I'm God." You know, they think I'm God, and they were probably saying, "Whew." Some other things about women. I brought this and this. Men weren't the only people to wear trousers in the family. Women were great fighters as well. We have historical records of women with Pamphile de Narvaez when he went earlier into Mexico to fight Cortez, because Cortez was getting too big for his britches, and the king was afraid that he was going to declare himself king of Mexico. So Pamphile de Narvaez was sent to Mexico, and there were several women in his group who fought as soldiers, fought valiantly. One was called La Bermudez, Beatriz de Bermuda, and she received an encomienda. There was another one, Maria Farfan, who said that she fought valiantly with a sword and a shield and with a spear or pike on a horse, or a lance, that's what I meant to say, a lance on horseback. Imagine that. These were married women too. They fought. They knew how to fight. They knew how to hold their own. They weren't ladies sitting, knitting or drinking tea or sipping wine, I guess it would be then. They would not be doing that. They would actually participate in battle when needed. Women also wore pants under their skirts. There are many skirts that they wore in the wintertime. It wasn't like other parts of Europe where they were scantily clad, if clad at all underneath their skirts. They had said, in fact, it is said that Juana, I called her Crazy Juana, but she was imprisoned. And it is said that she wore hers lined with fur. Well, you can imagine what it's like to live in the cold, in the wintertime, in a castle. I mean, all that rock, it would be pretty damp and nasty. So you'd want to have something to keep you warm. A woman, as you saw when I came in, a woman never went out in public without being properly shielded. And I wore one style that is worn as you come in. As I came in, this is one that I wore to cover my head. That was a proper thing. I think it probably still is a residual cultural from the culture of the Moors, because they covered their heads. So in Spain was Moorish for so long. And we still, at this period, wearing the Moresque styles of fabrics. As you can see, they're all kinds of designs, but you would never wear clothes like that that had animals and humans or things like that, living creatures designed into them. So the other thing that I'm wearing, this is a farthingale. And a farthingale at this time was kind of the way to wear your clothes. And then you wear another skirt and another skirt. And I could have, I've only got these few on, I could have maybe a dozen skirts on. And the reason you wanted to do this is that you wore your wealth on your body. Even the conquistadors wore as elaborate and as clothing as they could, because they had learned fighting wars in Europe that you could ransom yourself with your clothing. So I would also maybe have pearls. Oh, you have a nice string of pearls. Watch out, there might be a conquistador. That was one thing they could find here, were pearls, but not much gold. When you get on a ship, you were issued a pair of rope sandals from Mexico, made in Mexico. You can imagine wearing leather on those slippery decks on a ship would not be really safe. So this is one thing that you would have to help you on the ship. And they found in an archaeological site or in a shipwreck a whole hold full of these being shipped from Mexico to Spain. I didn't wear a tight-fitting bodice all the time. When I was working, probably when I was on the ship, I wouldn't have wanted to wear a tight-fitting bodice. So this is a nice apron, nice and loose and comfortable to wear. My sleeves can be removed, and when it's hot weather, or as the ladies like to do, you could exchange sleeves with other friends or give them as gifts. This is called a bum roll. Normally, I didn't get it on today, but normally you'd wear it around your waist and it would help this come out a little bit. Everything was kind of dangled around your waist, tied to your belt like this. And of course, to keep the hot sun off of my delicate face, I would wear something to shade it. And these are just a few of the things that I brought. Oh, spectacles. I don't need those. But if you did, these are a type made from bone and have magnifying glasses in them. So, are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
What's that tail that starts in your hat?
Oh, this is my hair. And probably some of you saw me earlier, and I don't really have hair this long. Well, neither did the Spanish ladies. Their hair was mostly in here, this part of it. Then you would take this part and you would stuff it with maybe lamb's wool or something like that and wrap it. And this is a horsetail. They had extensions too. And you would wear this so that you would find a color that matched your own hair, as closely as possible.
Where did you get the historical comments from, the early 16th century? Were the conquistadores good at keeping notes?
There were several records. They would have to report back to the king when they came back. So the records were kept in the Library of the Indies in Spain. And these were, you see, when someone like Pompeyo de Narvaez or Hernando de Soto or all these conquistadors were given a permission to come and explore a new land, Juan Ponce de Leon is another one, they would get a permit from the king. And it was basically a business contract. They would go out, established, get as much land as they could, whatever riches was found on it, the king would get a percentage. It was very much a legal contract. And so they had to report in detail what happened. And if the expedition failed, they definitely wanted to know why. So we're fortunate enough with this one where I get a lot of my information for my Maria story. Unfortunately, I don't know if Maria is her name but it was every other woman's name, so I gave her the name Maria. We don't know their names, but we do know there were 10 women on this expedition. We know there were several women on the De Soto expedition. We know that there were at least 2 women on the Juan Ponce de Leon expedition. A lot of people have done research now, and there's a lot more women on these expeditions than a few years ago people would even admit. In fact, I had to fight several times to make sure that women are represented in these historical reenactments. Even last year I was told, no, there were no women with the Juan Ponce de Leon, but her name was Juana Ruiz or Jimenez. Sometimes it's vague who they are, but they do know that she was on that expedition. Plus there may have been another woman, but we don't have that name. We know that in the De Soto expedition that there were several women. One, when you come, you bring slaves. You have to bring a contingent of slaves and servants. And De Soto was told that he had a huge expedition, but he had to bring, I think it was something like 200 servants to serve them. And 1/3 of those by law, by this legal contract, had to be women. We know that there were 2 women for sure on the De Soto expedition because we have references to them. But of course, women were not as important as men, so what they did was not considered really important. But they came as soldiers. They came as nurses. They came as wives. They came as people as servants to take care of all the needs of the soldiers. They just were there. Whether, they made detailed accounts or not, we know that they were there. And one of my goals is trying to write women back into our history. Any other questions?
What role, if any, did the Church of Rome have in authorizing or participating in the consent to go and explore?
That's an interesting story because at this time, King Charles V, who has become the Holy Roman Empire, 1527, he sacks Rome. He's trying to establish himself as the most important person in Christendom. That's what Europe was called at that time. So he sacks Rome. He makes Pope Clement, they say they make him cry. It's a really awful time. It's just, he takes not just Catholics with him, but he even takes Protestants with him. They say somebody wrote Luther in one of the paintings of Raphael. He carved it in there. He established himself as the most important person in Europe at the time, and the Pope. His role was to make sure that they tried to Christianize the Indians, and that was it. They paid a little bit of lip service to that. Of course, if you weren't a Christian, a Catholic Christian, they had no compunction with killing you or turning you into a slave. So it wasn't really, if they resisted, you're a slave. You know. So there's a lot of things going on. Of course, at one point, Las Casas, who was with Pamphilio de Narvaez when he entered Cuba, he was so horrified after a while by the violence that these conquistadors were perpetrating on the native people. Basically, they were doing ethnic cleansing or, you know, putting people into slavery, that he went and he begged the king and queen of Spain and the church to declare Native American people human. Because if you're human, you can't treat them like animals, and that's what they've been doing. It's a long, complicated story, but thank you.
What was his viewpoint on women?
Who's that?
The gentleman you were just describing.
Charles? I'm sure that it was what the usual, it was primogeniture there, so women always took a second place to men. However, they were useful, and back in the 13th century when they started the conquest of Spain, taking it from the Moors, they did establish a lot of rights for women, but men reigned supreme, always. The nice thing about Pamphilio de Narvaez's wife, she increased his wealth with his estates to 14,000 pesos. And I can't exactly remember how much that was worth, like somewhere between 60 and 90 dollars. But it was a lot of money for that time period. And she got to enjoy it all because he didn't come back. When
When did the Inquisition come?
Oh, that started pretty much in the 16th century. Around this time, it was really starting to take hold. It was taking hold when actually Columbus.
When did it come to New Spain?
To New Spain?
Did it go to Florida?
Not really. Not really. They weren't really doing, it was mostly Europeans and Spanish that they were, it was that whole thing with the Protestants. And they really went after the Protestants. And of course, Pedro Menendez de Avila finds a Protestant enclave in Fort Caroline, which is Jacksonville area, and attacks them. And those that don't escape and go out to sea, and many drowned. Some of them were shipwrecked near St. Augustine on Anastasia Island. Well, he takes a group of people out. And he promises them that he's going to do okay, but he takes them out and slits all their throats. So they did not like Protestants. So these are violent people. They were living in violent times. All the money that they brought back and gave to the king was used for violence. It was used for conquest in Europe itself. Europe was gray, because every town they went into, they would burn it to the ground. They would steal everything. That's how they were able to feed their armies, just by taking everything they could get their hands on. It was a horror. When you walked into a town, there would be people hanging on the wheel. I don't know if you know what a wheel is, but it's a horrific torture item where they would put people up on them. They'd break all their legs, weave their legs and arms in through the spokes of the wheel, put them up on a high pole, and leave them there to die. I mean, you're talking not really nice people.
All Christians.
And all good Christians. Yes.
Did your expedition land on the other side of Boca Ciega Bay in the jungle area?
We don't know for sure. Okay, there was an archaeological dig done there a few years ago, and they found that mound may have been built after, because they found things in the lower layers that were later Spanish beads and so on. It's still speculative. We know he landed somewhere on Boca Ciega Bay, or that's speculative too. There will be other archaeologists and historians who will argue to the ground on where they landed. Some people say Charlotte Harbor. But to me, when I read the accounts and the way they had to travel, Pinellas County is the only place that they could land on one side and walk across and find a bay on the other side. It's the only logical place. But there will be people that will deny that. So unfortunately, they didn't leave markers. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you.